the summer of 1842, a Virginia plantation owner named Edmund Hartwell sat down to write a letter to the county sheriff. Not a complaint letter, not a request for help, a letter of pure, concentrated humiliation. It said more or less, "He's gone again." 3 words, no explanation of how, no theory of where, just the cold, quiet reality that a man he legally owned had, once again, decided not to be owned. The man in question was about 6 feet tall, had a scar above his left eyebrow, and answered, when he felt like it, to the name James. But everyone called him Shadow. And by 1842, Shadow had already escaped 3 times. This wasn't a man who ran. This was a man who vanished. Here's the part they usually leave out of the history books. Not because it's a secret, but because it's uncomfortable. Slavery in the American South wasn't just brutal, it was bureaucratic. There were entire legal systems designed to make sure enslaved people couldn't leave, couldn't work for pay, couldn't learn to read, couldn't travel without written permission, and in most states, couldn't gather in groups larger than 5 without a white person present. Which, if you think about it, is a whole lot of rules for people they kept insisting weren't smart enough to deserve rights. James, Shadow, was born somewhere between 1820 and 1822 in Henrico County, Virginia. We don't know the exact date because nobody wrote it down. Take a second and sit with that. The people who claimed legal ownership over this man couldn't be bothered to record the day he was born. His mother was a house slave. His father, according to the official records, was listed as unknown, which in the language of the time usually meant something very specific that we are not going to spell out here. What we do know is this. From the time he could walk, James had a gift. He could move through space without drawing attention. Not invisibility. Nothing mystical about it. Just a presence, or really the deliberate absence of presence, that made people look right past him. He picked up early that the white men on the plantation looked at enslaved people the same way you look through a window. They registered the glass. They weren't actually seeing what was on the other side. James figured out that if he moved calmly, purposefully, with the right posture and the right pace, he became part of the scenery. He was 14 when the other enslaved people on the plantation started calling him Shadow. He was 16 when he used that gift for the first time. October 1836. Shadow was somewhere between 16 and 18 years old, depending on which account you trust, when he walked off the Hartwell plantation for the first time. He didn't run. He walked. He timed his exit for the end of the workday, that chaotic 40-minute window when overseers were doing their head counts, workers were dispersing, and nobody was watching any one person in particular. He went east, then north, then very, very quietly, north again. 3 days later, a patrol caught him at a river crossing. Here's what the capture report noted, and this detail actually matters. The patrol said he was calm, not panicked, not desperate, just calm. Like a man working through a problem rather than running from a crisis. They brought him back. He was punished. We don't need to specify how because you already know how, and it's exactly what you're picturing. But here's the thing about Shadow that made him different from every other man who'd ever been caught and dragged back to that plantation. He wasn't broken by it. He was taking notes. The river crossing had been the mistake. The timing had been right. The direction had been right. But he hadn't accounted for the patrol schedule at the water. He filed that away. And he waited. 18 months later, Shadow was gone again. This time, he went west first. The wrong direction for someone heading toward freedom, which is exactly why nobody thought to look there. He spent 4 days moving west before curving north in a long, slow arc that bypassed every major road and every known patrol checkpoint. He made it all the way to Maryland before he was caught. Not by a patrol, by hunger. He approached a farmhouse looking for food, and the farmer, a man with no personal stake in the situation, but apparently a very strong opinion about other people's property, recognized him from a description circulating around the county. Back he went. Another report. Another entry in the county ledger. Property returned. Condition defiant. That word. defiant. The overseers used it as an insult. Shadow probably used it as a business card. 3 months after that, he was gone a third time. This time, he moved only at night. He navigated by sound and terrain, the direction rivers ran, the way moss grew thicker on north-facing bark, the drop in temperature as the land opened toward the border. He was never taught to read. Couldn't read a map, a sign, or the wanted posters they were already starting to print with his description on them. But he could read the land. He made it further north than he'd ever been. Got close, genuinely close, to Pennsylvania. But close wasn't across. Recaptured at a checkpoint just a few miles from the state line. 3 times. He was somewhere around 19 or 20 years old. And this is when Edmund Hartwell, his owner, made the single most catastrophic decision of the entire decade. He sold Shadow. Because clearly, that would fix it. Let's pause here and talk about the plantation owners, because they deserve their own chapter. Not out of sympathy. The exact and total opposite of sympathy. These were men who had built entire economic identities around the idea that they were superior managers of inferior people. They wrote books about it, gave speeches about it, built legal frameworks, generated scientific-sounding theories, and created elaborate social rituals. All of it designed to support one single premise, that they were the competent ones and the people they enslaved were not. And then a teenager with no shoes, no map, no money, no legal right to exist as a human being, and no resources of any kind kept outsmarting them. Every single time Shadow escaped, it wasn't just a logistical problem for the plantation. It was an argument. He was making an argument, with his body and his feet, that the entire premise of the system was wrong. Edmund Hartwell sold Shadow to a larger operation in South Carolina. A man named William Croft. Cotton. 800 acres. The kind of plantation that was supposed to be escape-proof because it was further south, further from the border, surrounded by strangers who didn't know his face. Shadow lasted 7 months before he escaped again, which honestly was longer than anyone anticipated. He'd just been busy learning the new layout. This is where we need to slow down, because Shadow's story is about more than a running tally. It's a masterclass in how enslaved people actually navigated a system that was specifically engineered to contain them. And it was not magic. It was geography, psychology, timing, and an extraordinary understanding of how power actually works. Slave catchers of this period had a very specific picture of what a runaway looked like. Panicked, moving fast, dirty, suspicious. Shadow moved the opposite way. Slow, clean, deliberate. He wore his better clothes whenever he could get them. He walked on the part of the road where tradesmen walked, not where field workers did. He carried himself like a man with somewhere to be, not like a man who was running. He understood that most people only see what they're already expecting. By the 1840s, there was a quiet infrastructure of escape that had no name, no headquarters, and no membership list. It lived inside relationships. A free black barber who knew which road was clear, a Methodist farmer whose barn door was always unlocked on certain nights, a dock worker who could arrange passage without a word being written down. Trust passed between individuals, not organizations. Shadow didn't have a map of it. Nobody did. That was the point. You couldn't seize something that existed only in the decisions of individuals, made one at a time, in real time. He learned to identify these people the same way he read the land. Slowly, carefully, looking for the signals that were only meant to be found by someone who already knew what to look for. This is the one most people miss entirely. Shadow didn't escape in a panic. He waited. He planned. In one documented account, he spent 4 full months memorizing the patrol rotation of a single plantation before he moved a single step. 4 months. He knew which overseers stayed late on Thursdays. He knew where the dogs slept. He knew which fences were actually checked and which ones just looked like they were being checked. He was doing, with nothing but his feet, his eyes, and his memory, what we would today call operational security. He was running a full intelligence operation from inside a prison, alone. practically illiterate, with zero resources and zero margin for error. Escape number 4 came from William Croft's South Carolina plantation. February 1844. Shadow had been there 7 months. At this point, he knew the property better than some of the overseers. He left on a Tuesday because, as he explained later, on Tuesdays, nobody ever expects anything to happen. He was right. He moved through South Carolina, passed through North Carolina, navigated around 2 major patrol checkpoints, and got close enough to Virginia, the northern part, the right side of the line, that he could literally see free people walking around like it was completely normal. He got caught at a church, not because he did anything suspicious, because a man in the congregation recognized him from a description. Wrong church, wrong Sunday, wrong county. Back south. Escape number 5 came from the same plantation, 4 months later. This time, Croft had invested in security upgrades. New fencing, more dogs, a brand new overseer who'd been hired specifically for his reputation of catching runaways. Shadow was gone within 6 weeks of that overseer's arrival. The overseer quit 2 months after that. Nobody ever officially confirmed these 2 events were connected. Nobody needed to. Escape number 6 came from a third plantation. Shadow had been sold again, this time to a man in Georgia because surely Georgia was far enough. In the winter of 1845, the Georgia escape became something of a local legend because Shadow didn't just escape this time. He left a note. He couldn't read. He couldn't write. But somewhere along the way he'd learned to copy out a few specific lines of text, phonetically, from memory, and the note, found on his empty sleeping pallet, read, "Gone north, don't bother." 3 words of announcement. 2 words of friendly advice. The plantation owner did not take the advice. He bothered. It didn't help. By 1847, Shadow was famous, in a very specific and very strange way. Not in the newspapers, though his name was starting to appear in runaway slave notices with growing frequency. He was famous the way things get famous in oral culture. By word of mouth, through letters passed between plantation owners, through the tense, humiliated correspondence of men who genuinely could not believe they kept losing the same person. The reward on his head had climbed to $500. In 1847, $500 was roughly the full annual wage of an average laboring man. Not a small sum. It was the kind of number you print in big block letters on a poster, which they did. The poster described him as approximately 24, 26 years of age, medium height, scar above the left eye, manner, calm, speaks clearly, will likely be dressed respectably and traveling with confidence. Do not be deceived by his composure. That last line. Do not be deceived by his composure. That is a wanted poster admitting that they were scared of how normal he looked. That is a wanted poster with a warning label on it. Multiple professional slave catchers accepted the contract. The first, a man who operated across 3 states and was very proud of his documented success rate, searched for Shadow for 11 months. He came back to collect his expenses. No results. The second lasted 4 months before writing a letter to the posting plantation owner that historians have described as, and I am genuinely not making this up, despairing in tone. A professional manhunter. Despairing. Shadow had reached such a level of competence at disappearing that he was actively demoralizing people whose entire profession was finding people. The 7th escape is the most documented of the whole series because it's the one where Shadow came the closest to not making it. He was working his way north through the mountains of western Virginia, terrain he'd chosen specifically because it was difficult to navigate and therefore lightly patrolled, when a group of men, not official slave catchers but the freelance kind who chased bounties for sport, cornered him in a creek bed. 4 of them. Shadow had no weapon. What he had was something better. He talked. Not to confuse them, not to beg. He talked the way a man talks when he's completely done being afraid, directly, calmly, with the specific confidence of someone who has been in tighter spots than this and is now mostly just irritated that his schedule got interrupted. He told them the bounty posting had expired, that the man who put it up had sold the contract to someone else, that they had, in effect, been working for free. Was any of that true? Doesn't matter. One of the four men hesitated. That was enough. Shadow moved in the seconds of confusion. That hesitation opened up and was gone into the tree line before anyone could react. Escape 7. Done. Escape number 8 is where the story gets quietly remarkable. By this point, we're somewhere in 1847 to 1848, Shadow had been bought and sold so many times that tracking his current legal owner required a small research project. The 8th escape came from a farm in Tennessee. Smaller operation than his previous locations. It stands out for exactly one reason. He brought someone with him. A woman named Martha, another enslaved person on the property, had a young child. Shadow, based on multiple later accounts, spent 3 weeks helping her map a route north. He identified the safest roads, told her where to stop, described who to trust and who to avoid. He didn't have to do that. It made his own escape considerably more complicated. It slowed him down. It doubled his exposure. Any one of a dozen things could have gone wrong for both of them. He did it anyway. They both made it north. Martha's account of the escape, recorded by a Quaker abolitionist in Ohio, described Shadow as the calmest person I have ever met in my life, and I have met a great many people. That is one of the kindest things anyone has ever written about anyone. 1848. James, Shadow, was somewhere between 26 and 28 years old. He'd been bought and sold 6 times. Recaptured 4 times. Walked, by rough estimate, over 1,000 miles across some of the most aggressively monitored territory in North America. And he was done getting caught. The 9th escape came from a plantation in Kentucky, his second to last stop before the Ohio River. He crossed on a night in March when the river was running high and cold, and no person in their right mind was anywhere near the water. Shadow was apparently not in his right mind. Or more precisely, he'd calculated that the danger of the river was lower than the danger of the patrol on the bank. He was right. The patrol was there. The patrol was always there. But the patrol wasn't in the water. He made it across. He found the farmhouse in Ohio he'd been given directions to. A stop on the network. A location passed to him before he'd even reached Kentucky. He made it to Pennsylvania. And then finally, he made it to Canada. He arrived in Ontario in late 1848, where a community of formerly enslaved people had built what was essentially a small functioning town. People who had all made their own versions of this same journey, who understood exactly what it meant to arrive somewhere with nothing but your own body and a lifetime of experience you'd never asked for. He arrived in the spring, and for the first time in his entire life, nobody was looking for him. Here's the part that usually gets cut from the escape stories. We talk about the escapes because they're genuinely incredible. Because 9 times is honestly kind of absurd. Because this man outmaneuvered a system backed by the full legal and financial weight of the most powerful economy in the Western Hemisphere. And he did it with his hands and his feet and his mind. But let's zoom out for a second. Historians estimate that in Virginia alone, just one state, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 enslaved people attempted to escape every single year during the 1840s and 1850s. Not all of them made it. Many were caught at the first river, the first road, the first hungry day. Shadow attempted 9 times before getting all the way through. 9 attempts is not a story of failure. 9 attempts is a story of someone who refused to accept the result. Most people, when they fail at something once, recalibrate. When they fail twice, they wonder if it's possible. By the 3rd time, a lot of people stop. Shadow didn't stop getting caught until escape number 9. And he didn't waste a single capture. Every recapture gave him information. Every failed route gave him a better one. He was stress testing an entire system with his own body as the instrument, eliminating each mistake, adjusting each variable until he'd built a path with no failures left in it. There's a word for that process. Engineers call it iteration. Enslaved people in 1840 called it the only option they had. But here's the other thing Shadow left behind, the one that didn't make it into any history book. He talked. After he arrived in Canada, he spent years telling his story. To anyone who would listen. To abolitionist groups, to newspapers, to other formerly enslaved people who hadn't made it yet and needed to hear that it was possible. He described routes. He named the specific farms, barns, and church basements where a person could stop without being turned in. He laid out the psychology of moving through a space where everyone is theoretically watching for you. His stories helped other people get out. We don't know exactly how many. We know it was more than one. We know that for every shadow who ran 9 times and eventually made it, there were people out there who only needed to run once, because shadow had already done the work of mapping the way through. That's not a footnote. That's the whole point. Let's come back to Edmund Hartwell, the man who wrote that letter. He's gone again. Hartwell died in 1862. He never financially recovered, and by multiple accounts never psychologically recovered, from losing his property so many times. Records suggest he became something of a cautionary tale in his county. The man who couldn't hold his slaves, mentioned in hushed, embarrassed tones by neighbors who found the whole situation mortifying. He never understood what had happened to him. What happened to him was simple. He tried to own a person, and the person said no. Not once, not twice, 9 times. With patience, with intelligence, with the kind of sustained discipline that most of us couldn't hold together for 9 hours, let alone 9 escapes spread out over a decade. Shadow's story doesn't fit the usual mold of resistance. It's not a rebellion, not a famous speech, not a published autobiography. It's quieter than that, more personal. It's one man, doing the same thing over and over, getting a little better every time, because the alternative was accepting a version of himself that he'd decided, somewhere early, somewhere deep, was just plain wrong. He wasn't property. He knew that. And he kept proving it until the people who disagreed ran completely out of options. If you want to understand what it actually took to keep slavery running, not just the chains and the laws and the violence, but the effort, the relentless, grinding, daily effort of convincing people that their own freedom wasn't worth chasing, understand this. It took one man with no resources, no map, no legal rights, and no name the state would recognize 9 separate tries to permanently walk out of the system. And the system, with all its money and laws and dogs and fences, failed all 9 times. 9. The chains didn't hold. The dogs lost the trail. The fences meant nothing. The only thing they never figured out how to contain was the one thing that mattered most. James knew exactly who he was from the very beginning. They called him Shadow, because he was always one step ahead of whatever light they tried to shine on him. You can't own what you can never catch.